And of course, good evening. It's May 21st, 2024, when our next collection of discussions in our Outside the Class series. It's another series with Tim Mackie. It's called Eat This Book. On TheDustyFeet.com, in the Outside the Class section, we have the Eat This Book source video section set up for your review. Because the intent of Outside the Class is for you to listen to the in-class lecture first. They would be found, of course, in the source video playlist. We try to keep these to about 15-20 minutes or so, because we want to make them easy to catch and easier to catch up on. So we're finishing our Eat This Book series with Israel's Redemption, a word from God, on Outside the Class, on the Dusty Feet. And of course, before we forget, if you find these kinds of podcasts useful, it's when you click the subscribe button. The reminders, they just help you. But also, if you think that these might be useful to others, that is when you click that like button, because that is the way that YouTube chooses to share these to more people if they wish. So Eat This Book, Israel's Redemption, a word from God, and this is part 2, our last one. So they, the children of Israel, they were allowed to return with Nehemiah to Jerusalem. And then, along with those that are still in the land, we find them gathered in the square at the Water Gate in Jerusalem. There's a platform in front of them. On it stands Nehemiah, Ezra, and the surrounding Levites. So they pull out the scrolls. They start reading Torah. The story as it was meant to be told, the story as it was meant to be passed on, the story as it was meant to be lived. They are expectant, they're humble, and they are prepared to hear the word of God. So, let the story commence. What's interesting is, I think, that we lose the thought that this was a whole story shared with them. Because we have our sections, our chapters, our verses, we often just look at these in little snips, little quips, because I think we want to do the clips. We want to cut out. We want to use what we want to use, when actually, it's an entire story. Here's where Nehemiah calls for Ezra, the priest and scribe. He's the one that unrolls the scroll, and he reads. And he starts at the beginning. And for the next very many number of hours, they listen. I'd say maybe they lean in close to hear. Because these are people that have been the victims of aggression, captivity. And now they've been allowed to return home. It's been, say, 70 years. In that, even the nation that captured them have been captured itself, because Persia is now the power broker on the block. They just do things differently. Because general practice, they don't arbitrarily strip a country bare. They leave them behind to live in their land, these people, to do what they do. Persia just leaves behind management in charge. Collect the taxes they have to pay. So this king of Persia, he's allowed Nehemiah to return with his people and move into and rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. Like I said, it's been 70 years. Those that survived, they've seen a lot. Because the way things were done in the land before, well, those that survived, not so good. But with those that survive have been those that have never been in the land. They were born in captivity in a foreign land. Maybe they've only heard of the stories of Torah, but they've never heard the entire story for themselves. When they return, of course, they're not in charge. They're just allowed to rebuild both the temple and the city. Nehemiah, he's even given a checkbook, right, sort of, with funds for a rebuild. It's funny, he even gets the blessing from the king of Persia. So Nehemiah, he returns, and he sees the actual devastation. That third wave of the Babylon attack, it just laid waste to Jerusalem. It stripped and destroyed the temple completely. So we get to a point here where Nehemiah comes back. He has permission to rebuild, and he rebuilds the walls and the temple. But it made me think a bit, because I thought back to Nehemiah rebuilding the temple, and we've had the stories, so we've heard them that Solomon, this was a beautiful temple. One might say borderline on opulent, right? Solomon, he wanted to make it a place of recognition of God, and it's just the way he thought it should be. But that temple has been stripped of everything. So Nehemiah has to build it up again. But I wonder if, and I probably suspect, that it's not quite as opulent as Solomon had made it. It's probably a bit more simple, not as ornate. I think more like the trappings of the original tabernacle, right? Just the items that were called for. Maybe a bit more subdued. I think I kind of like the term focused, because they had to recreate all the pieces that they don't have. But at this point, there is no Ark of the Covenant. There are no tablets. There is no staff of Aaron. But they rebuild the walls again. They rebuild the temple. Read the book of Nehemiah. It is fascinating. And the stories around all of that, they're well worth a read. But here's the point. Before all of that, because he hasn't rebuilt anything yet, at this point, they're just there, home, in the land, in Jerusalem. And they've gathered at the Watergate. So what do? They build a platform because they want these folks to stand on it, because the crowd wants to see them. They want to hear them, because some of them have never heard this all before. And the Levites that surround Nehemiah and Ezra, that's a whole different study on them. That's a whole different rabbi trail to go down. We definitely don't have time to do that here. But it is fascinating to go down and find out about the names of the people, the meanings of those names, and what goes on. It's thought-provoking. But like Tim said, this is basically a small group. They hear this story of Torah. They finally hear it, the whole story. And they weep. Tears of sadness. Maybe tears of joy. Because this is deeply emotional for them, right? This is deeply a mixture of sadness and joy. Because while we're here, this is a sad story, because they now realize the whole reason they're in this tragic state. The whole point that we're here is tragic. But they're going to hear, again, some of them for the first time, that we go from Adam and Eve all the way to Noah, all the way to Abraham, all the way to Moses. I think they might even have a deeper connection with those first children of Israel in the Exodus, being out, coming in. But they're back in the land, back in Jerusalem, and they're going to begin. But they're going to begin, as it were, with a feast. I love God's timing. We get the privilege of seeing it behind us, but they're in it. So I wonder when, as they were hearing it, the story read, they realized when in the biblical cycle of these Moedim, those appointed times, those feast days, that they realize they're about to enter Sukkot. They're in Jerusalem. They could be looking at the rubble of the temple. They could probably see it from when they stood at the Watergate. But then they start to experience this. They are connecting with the story of the Torah. And they're weeping. Sadness. Maybe a bit of joy. But Nehemiah sees this and he realizes that they need to do the proverbial turn that frown upside down. So Nehemiah, he reminds them of Sukkot, that they need to celebrate. They need to be in the moment of Sukkot. Remember, Nehemiah has a checkbook, so he tells them to go get the best food, get the best drink, because they are going to do Sukkot right. It's probably fitting since, in the rubble and the rebuild, I suspect that they, for the most part, they're still probably even temporary dwellings for most of them. But now for here, so on TheDustyFeet.com, we've covered Sukkot before. I'm going to put those links in the description so you'll have a good picture of what we're talking about. Those videos are all in the Aleph Beta section. Because when we're here, and there's a good chance it's the first time for a number of these people that they've heard it. But I'd say for those that are the elderly, those older ones, it's a reminder. Still think it was the majority, still it was their first. But Nehemiah 8:15, so they proclaimed and circulated a proclamation to all their cities and in Jerusalem, saying, go out to the hills, bring olive branches, bring wild olive branches, myrtle branches, palm branches, branches of other leafy trees, to make booths, as it is written. So they go out and they collect these branches. They all are ready to celebrate Sukkot. Those tears of sadness turning into tears of joy. Feast. The leaders that were gathered were sent out to spread the word. They said to make sure that even those that have not prepared, make sure that there was still plenty for them. Made plenty for all of them to eat and to drink. God took care of their ancestors for 40 years. And that, in the Feast of Sukkot, for that length of time, they're supposed to remember. And then they're supposed to eat and eat well. Drink. And drink well. Tears of sadness, tears of joy. And all of that, God drops them right smack in the middle of Sukkot to celebrate, to enjoy, to experience it. It's not surprising God's timing. God has a masterful way of bringing us to a point to maybe double remind us, kind of like a double stomp on a floor. Yeah. Because that's where they were in this part of the Nehemiah story. So God wanted to remind them, enjoy the time. Experience it. I think maybe at times, even today, I don't think we really appreciate the feasts. I mean, we know the event. We see them as a spot on the calendar. Yet I don't think often enough we take the time to really experience them. And Sukkot happens to be a wonderful experience. This is exactly what they needed. And they're going to go through it with the Feast of Sukkot. And yeah, that's going to bring tears of sadness. And it's going to bring a lot of tears of joy as they begin this new journey of theirs, as they begin rebuilding the temple, rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, and they are starting to become a presence in the land again. It's a bit of a trip down the road, about 400 years in total, and we'll find ourselves in the story of a young child born, fleeing, returning, and the people in the land and that temple, they have a direct line to here. I love connected stories. And now we have a little different view about how we got to where we are 2,000 plus years later. And here is where we are as we end this Outside the Class series with Tim Mackie with Eat This Book. It's been a wonderful series. I've really enjoyed it. And so we're going to begin another series next week, hopefully. And hopefully that will be fun to explore as well. But thanks for with us tonight on another edition of Outside the Class with Israel's Redemption, a Word from God on the Dusty Feet.